Good afternoon, everybody. Hello there. You all right? Good. Thank you for being here, everyone. I'd like to begin this show which is all about Samuel Johnson, as you know, one of my great heroes, by reading something to you from this book, The Life of Samuel Johnson, by his friend James Boswell, the young Edinburgh lad who came down to London in 1762 to meet all his great heroes. And the one he most wanted to meet was Samuel Johnson, the author of the dictionary, of the magisterial Rambler essays, and Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, the epic poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes, amongst many other pieces. And he finally got to meet his hero, and in this wonderful biography, he describes a day trip they took to Greenwich. And he tells this story, which is really my favorite story in the book. It goes like this. On Saturday, July 30th, Dr. Johnson and I took a sculler at Temple Stairs. That's one of those boats which a lad rows at the front like that. At Temple Stairs, and set out for Greenwich. I asked him if he really thought that a knowledge of the Greek and Latin languages was an essential requisite to a good education. Johnson, in his Lichfield accent, answers, most certainly, sir. For those who know them have a very great advantage over those who do not. Nay, sir, it is wonderful what a difference learning makes upon people, even in the common intercourse of life, which does not appear to be much connected with it. And yet, said I, people go through the world very well and carry on the business of life to good advantage without learning. Why, sir, that may be true in cases where learning cannot possibly be of any use. This boy, for instance, rows us as well without learning as if he could sing the song of Orpheus to the Argonauts, who were the first sailors. And then he'd call to the boy, what would you give my lad to know about the Argonauts? Sir, said the boy, I would give what I have. Dr. Johnson was very pleased with this answer, and we gave the lad double fare. Then turning to me, he said, sir, a desire of knowledge is the natural feeling of mankind. And every human being whose mind is not debauched will be willing to give all that he has to get knowledge. Well, I don't know how debauched your minds are. After 3 or, what is it 4 weeks of the Fringe? I'm feeling a bit debauched myself. But I love that story because it gives you so much about this wonderful man, Samuel Johnson. And I suppose it begins to answer the question of why it is I'm doing this show. Now, a lot of people are being puzzled to find me doing a show about an 18th century lexicographer, because I'm best known for the one-man shows I've done over the years about Kenneth Williams and Frankie Howard, all those dead camp comedians, and various other subjects that I've touched on, including Noel Coward. I was on this very stage until a week ago singing the songs of Noel Coward, and here I am talking about this lexicographer. And, well, the reason I'm doing this show really is because I love him. I discovered him about 12 years ago when I was on tour, and I wandered into a second-hand bookshop somewhere in Devon and found this book, actually, Boswell's London Journal, where he describes his first meeting with Samuel Johnson, and describes, in fact, everyday life in mid-18th century London. And I fell in love with Dr. Johnson, his whole character and his wonderful sayings. And, of course, this is the 300th anniversary of his birth this year. He was born in 1709, so this is his Tercentenary. And I thought, well, why not do a show about him? And when I started talking about this to friends of mine, talking about Samuel Johnson, I was amazed how few people knew anything about him. Nobody seems to know anything about Samuel Johnson. You know, people will say things. Actually, when you mention his name, the same look comes into people's eyes. Always the same look. A look that seems to say, I should know who this is. Oh, I feel so ignorant. Samuel Johnson, yes. And then sometimes they say, oh, yes, he was the man who invented baby powder, wasn't he? You hear that quite a lot. And then the other thing they say is, oh, yes, with great confidence. Oh, yes, of course, Samuel, yeah, he was great. He wrote a wonderful diary about London life, didn't he? And he had lots of women, and he got the clap, and witnessed the great fire. You say, no, that's Samuel Pepys. That's a different Samuel. That was 100 years earlier. This is Samuel Johnson. And very few people do seem to know anything about him. Let's just have a quick show of hands. And how many people know anything about Samuel Johnson? Anybody know? Oh, yes, look at these hands going up here. Very proud of your knowledge. Very good. There's quite a few Johnsonians. Hello, you know about him, do you? Do you mind me asking off the cuff, sir? How do you know Johnson? What from?
Various readings over the years.
Yes?
I mean, I'm not actually read the biography of Boswell.
You haven't read Boswell? That's what most people... Dipped in. Yes, extracts. What do you know him from, then?
Well, just general background knowledge. You know?
Background knowledge, yes. Well, there are lots of things that I found that I did already know about Johnson because of mostly his one-liners, his sayings, which actually come mostly from Boswell and are quite familiar to us now. The famous one bit. Anybody know any of his famous one-liners? What about? Yes, go on.
Thus I refute Berkeley by kicking the stone.
Oh, yes, that's a novel. You don't hear that one very often. They were talking about a Bishop Berkeley who had an argument that you couldn't prove that matter really existed if you argued it intellectually. And Johnson was furious about this, and he was walking along with Boswell, I think, and he kicked a stone as hard as he could. Really, like that. And he said, I refute it thus. That's, yeah, you don't hear that one very much. And then the man who is tired of London is tired of life. You heard that? Man who's tired of London. Actually, the full quote goes, well, Boswell was talking to Johnson about moving. He couldn't decide whether to move from Edinburgh, where he lived, down to London. He felt that maybe London would lose its sparkle and its novelty if he was living there all the time. And Johnson says, you will find no man at all intellectual who is willing to leave London. The man who is tired of London is tired of life, for in London is all that life can afford. Actually, I was having some work done on my bathroom at home last year, and the plumber said that he was thinking of moving away from London to Darlington. So I quoted this to him. I said, oh, you know what Dr. Johnson said? The man who is tired of London is tired of life, for London is all that life can afford. And he said, yeah, well, the key word there is afford, isn't it? I can't afford it here anymore. So he's gone to Darlington. It's terrible because we need work done as well. But he'll be back. There's not much intellectual distraction in Darlington, I'm afraid. But, so that one, the man is tired of London. Did you put your hand up, sir? Do you know a Johnsonian phrase? Or were you scratching your nose? Stay away from auctions.
Something like...
Yeah. Rack your brains.
The best view that Scotsman will ever see is an ultra.
The higher that leads it, right, okay, very good, yes, that's good. That's in the life of Boswell, the life of Johnson by Boswell. Now, some of you may know that Johnson is famous for having a sort of antipathy to the Scotch, as they were then called. I don't know when it became an insult to call people Scotch instead of Scots, but in those days, everybody said Scotch, meaning Scots. And Johnson did have a certain, well, he always had to win every argument. And at that time, London was full of Scotchmen, you know, who were looking for work, because there was very little up here in Scotland. And they're all down there in London going on about how wonderful Scotland was. So, of course, this riled him, and he would never miss an opportunity to try and put one over on there. And there's a dinner which... have you got the picture, Phil, of Johnson at the club, at the Turk's Head? He had a weekly club where they'd all meet. There they are. There's Boswell sitting there behind him, making mental notes of everything he's saying. Johnson, of course, right there. Then you have Joshua Reynolds, his very good friend, the great painter who painted many of the famous portraits of Johnson, founder of the Royal Academy. Baretti, another friend of theirs. And actually the whole table is a much longer picture. It actually goes all the way down there, and all the great minds of the day are sitting there. And you can see from the picture, they're all hanging on his every word, wanting to know what he's going to say. And on this occasion at the club, let's see if I can find it. Oh dear, where is it? Hang on, bear with me, I have it here. Here we are, that's it. It's, Boswell describes it like this. He says there was, amongst the other people, there was a Reverend John Ogilvie, who was unlucky enough to choose for the topic of his conversation the praises of his native country. He began with saying that there was very rich land around Edinburgh. Oliver Goldsmith, who was present, who had studied physic there, contradicted this very untruly with a sneering laugh. Disconcerted a little by this, Mr. Ogilvie then took new ground, where I suppose he thought himself perfectly safe, for he observed that Scotland had a great many noble wild prospects, meaning amazing countryside and hills and all that. And Johnson, I believe, sir, you have a great many. Norway, too, has noble wild prospects, and Lapland is remarkable for its prodigious noble wild prospects. But, sir, let me tell you, the noblest prospect which a Scotchman ever sees is the high road that leads him to England. This unexpected and pointed sally produced a roar of applause. So that was one of his little quips. Actually, he was a lot of his friends were Scottish, and he, of course, as you may know, he later actually made a trip to Scotland himself with Boswell, in which they covered the whole of the country, from Edinburgh right through the Highlands and Islands, and he made many very fascinating and compassionate observations about life as it was lived by the Highlanders at that time. But anyway, that's a good one. Thank you. Very good. Any others? Any famous Johnsonian phrase? Go on.
Well, I think it's from the dictionary. It's something about oats.
In
England, you feed them to...
Yes. Bookmark that. Bookmark that. We'll come back to that one. Very good. Yes. Okay. I'll come back to you on that. Any other famous Johnsonian sayings? Well, there's the one where he says, where Boswell says to him that he's heard there are some very good female Quaker preachers. Johnson says, a woman preacher is like a dog walking on its hinder legs. It is not done well, but we are surprised to see it done at all. And the famous one where he was at dinner after the dictionary had been published, and a lady sitting next to him said, tell me, Dr. Johnson, why did you define the word pastern as the knee of a horse? It was actually, it's a little bone in the ankle. And Johnson says, ignorance, madam, pure ignorance. Now, for some reason, Boswellian Johnsons, the one who know him from Boswell, loved that ignorance, the bluff kind of dismissing of this question. But it does bring us rather nicely to the dictionary. This book. Phil, do you have the title page so you can see that page a little bit more clearly on the screen? The dictionary. Now, this was the work that really made Johnson, made his life, gave his life meaning, I suppose, and changed it as well. Because up until that time, it is a dictionary of the English language in which the words are deduced from their originals and illustrated in their different significations by examples from the best writers. And you also have the history of the language and the English grammar by Samuel Johnson, A.M. This was actually where the doctor part of his name comes in. He was given an honorary degree as a recognition for having done this work just before it was published, so they could put A.M. Next to his name. But he never used it himself. He was just Mr. Sam Johnson, as far as he was concerned. So up until this point, there had been no dictionary. I mean, there had been shorter versions. There had been lexicons of difficult words, glossaries of technical terms, and a couple of brief attempts at using some words from the English language. But this was the first time anybody had really tried to do a comprehensive dictionary of English as it was spoken at that time. All those people chattering away for hundreds and hundreds of years, and nobody had ever tried to pin it down. And this was considered a great, terrible disgrace to Great Britain, because the French had their great magisterial dictionary. You had the Italian one, and of course all the classical languages had been compiled into volumes and volumes of dictionaries, but no English dictionary. And so this conglomerate of publishers decided that this was a terrible disgrace and they must find somebody who could do the job and finally give us a bit of dignity to the English language. So they looked around and somebody suggested this Johnson, this Samuel Johnson. Now he had been, up until that point, a kind of struggling hack writer. He was born in Lichfield, 1709, to a father who was an unsuccessful bookshop owner, and after an attempt himself to become a school teacher, which failed, he then made the trip down to London and spent years, decades, penniless, going from job to job, getting any work he could, trudging sometimes the streets of London with nowhere to live, arguing with his friends about politics to keep them, to give them spirit and to keep them going. And he did eventually get a job compiling a catalogue of all the books and pamphlets in a huge private library. And this was a massive task. You had to read every book, or at least do a précis of every single book in that library, and eventually produce this enormous list. And the publishers thought, well, this is a man who knows how to collate vast amounts of information, and he needs the work. We'll give it to Samuel Johnson. And he took it on as a great moral task, you see. I think he felt that this was a moral duty on his part. He'd been given this opportunity, and it was an opportunity really to give his own life some meaning and to do some work that he could be really proud of. So he took it on, and they gave him an advance of £1,757, which they thought would take him through the 3 years they thought it would take to write this book. 3 years, that's what they thought. And Johnson did too at first. A friend of his, Dr. Adams, said to him, you do realize, Johnson, that it took the French Academy 40 members 40 years to produce their great dictionary. And Johnson did a quick calculation. He said, 40 times 40 is 1,600. As 3 to 1,600, so is the proportion of an Englishman to a Frenchman. And it actually took 9 years. 9 long, hard, difficult years, during which he suffered poverty and terrible, terrible depressions. Really, the black dog, as he called it, and he had to haul himself out of these depressions. His wife died while he was writing it. A strange woman, actually. She was 21 years older than him. A strange little over-made-up woman addicted to opium and alcohol, who just lay in bed for the last few years of her life, refusing to give him his oats. And nobody, people couldn't see what he saw in her, but she was really the only one who'd marry him. And when she died, he was absolutely devastated. I mean, he always took the deaths of his friends and people he loved very, very hard indeed. And he went into a deep depression. He had to haul himself out and really continue working on this book. Now, how do you begin? Where do you begin writing a dictionary? Eh?
Great literature.
Great literature, yes. Most people say A. But yes, great literature indeed. But let's get to A, actually. Boswell got it wrong. And this is an indication that Boswell, if you're looking for information about Samuel Johnson, Boswell is very entertaining, but he's not to be taken as gospel. He got things wrong sometimes. And he said that he thought that Johnson started with the alphabet. He wrote it out, and he thought he then wrote underneath each letter all the words he could think of, beginning with that letter, then did the definitions, and then went out and sourced all the illustrative quotations from the best writers, which, of course, would have taken probably hundreds of years. But you're right, what Johnson actually began by doing was reading. And he devoured whole libraries of books. He had to be cognizant of and on top of every single area of knowledge, which he already was. He already had a vast knowledge, which he'd just crammed knowledge into his head. He said he did all his most important reading before he was 18 years old. And that's why at university, I mean, he did 1 year at Pembroke College before he ran out of money and had to then go out into the streets and try and make his living. But he was bored there anyway, because he knew more than any of his lecturers. He got there at 18. But he started to read, and he had to get to know about, I mean, you name it, everything. Not just literature, but warfare, military law, legal matters, all the sciences. And he read and read and read and read. And what he would do, he would be going through these books, and he would have all these little, little ticketed bits in there. He would go through, and he would find a word that interested him, and he would underline it. He would write the initial letter of the word in the margin. And then he would box off the quote that he wanted to use, the illustrative quote, and piles of these books, and he would then hand these to his amanuenses, who were really mostly impoverished Scotsmen, on whom he took pity because he knew what it was like to be a struggling hack writer. And as I said, London was full of Scotsmen who needed work, and he could have done it with probably 1 or 2 amanuenses, but he took on 8. And then kept them employed for 8 years and kept them out of danger. And so they had the work of copying out all these quotes onto little strips of paper, and they filed them all away, and eventually had thousands and thousands of words, 42,000 of which appear in this book. 42,000 words. And then, once he'd done that, he started to write the definitions. And Phil, do you have the full page, just so you can see what a full page of the dictionary looks like, how dense it is with knowledge and information. And he starts with A, of course. Do you have there it is. Oh, well, you can see. Well, actually, you probably can't read it there. Critic appears there. But it's just, that's how it was all laid out, in these columns, pasted on, and then page by page sent to the printer, and after 9 years finally printed. This is my copy, by the way, if anyone's thinking of stealing it. It's only a facsimile. The original is, well, both volumes are this size because it's printed on very thick, so enormous work. But this is my copy, which I got on the internet, and it's still available. You can find them. Starts with A, describing the letter. The first letter of the European alphabet has in the English language 3 different sounds which may be termed the broad, open, and slender. So then he starts with the sound of the letter. And then after, goes to about here before he comes to the first word, A, B. And on he went with it. A long and laborious task. But of course, there are some famous definitions from the dictionary which have come to us and which people still know about, rather like these funny one-liners. What was the word? Oats. Oats. Phil, do you happen to have the definition for oats that you can throw up on the screen there? There you are. Oh, isn't technology wonderful? Oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. He was much taken to task for that definition, although it was, at the time, literally true, as he discovered himself in 1775 when he went on his tour with Boswell and wrote very compassionately about the hardships that people suffered. There's a line that always sticks in my mind where he says, "The dark months are here a time of great distress, because the summer can hardly feed itself, and the winter comes with its cold and scarcity upon families very slenderly provided," which horrified him. And he writes a lot about how people struggled to live up here. So oats, that's a good one. Anybody know any of the other famous definitions? Yes?
Well, he's a self-parody lexicographer.
Lexicographer, very good. Phil, go on.
Harmless drudge.
That's it, you got it, yes sir. A writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. Of course, it's the harmless drudge that stands out there. That's not really what you would call a scientific description of it's a poetic description of really his own life, his own condition at the time. That's what he felt himself to be, a harmless drudge. Any others that you know? Thank you for that one.
Related to that,
Yes?
is a definition of the word dull.
Dull?
Dull meaning something like boring, not interesting, as in to make dictionaries is dull work.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, yes. Well, you've said it now. But that's absolutely right. That's one that nobody's ever called out before. To make dictionaries is dull work, which again is, well, it's true, but he's using that as illustration to illustrate his own condition at the time, how he felt about this work. Dull, drudgery. Yes, very good. Thank you for that one. I'll make a mental note. We'll use that one. We'll get a slide of that one. Any other good one? Anybody you know? Any? No. Patron? He had a famous definition that he was criticised for the word patron. Phil, would you please? There we go. Patron, one who countenances, supports, or protects, commonly a wretch, who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery, which is pure Johnson. And actually, again, he was very much criticised for, but there is a reason for that, because you see, this book did have a patron, or an alleged patron, the Earl of Chesterfield. It was really a kind of marketing device. The publicists thought, well, we need the name of a great man on the title page to dedicate it to, just to sell a few more copies, give it a ring of authority. So they asked the Earl of Chesterfield, who was one of the great statesmen of his day, a military man, a poet, and a statesman, politician, very highly respected. And Johnson duly wrote a dedication to the Earl of Chesterfield and then heard nothing whatsoever from him for the whole long, hard 9 years. And finally, when the book was about to be published, somebody said to Chesterfield, look, the book's coming out, you should write something, And so Chesterfield wrote a little piece saying, at last, the dictionary bearing my name is coming out. And Johnson was furious after all those years of slogging. And so he wrote a very famous letter, one of the great, most sarcastic letters in the English language. The one line of which, there's one line that really stands out because it gives you an idea. When I say that, I mean an idea in the way that Johnson insisted the word should be used, meaning not just a notion, but something you can actually picture in your mind, a mind image. That was his strict definition of idea. I find it very hard to use the word idea without now meaning something that should be pictured in mind. And he says in the letter, there's one line, he says, is not a patron, my lord, one who looks looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help. Wonderful. And Chesterfield was delighted. He put this letter on display for all his guests. Look what he said about me. He wasn't the least bit ashamed about it. But so there was that. And any other one more? Any patron? Yes. What was the other one? Oh, there's another one that we found the other day, actually. Excise. Excise. Anyone who's had to struggle with the tax man will know about the excise. A hateful tax. Hateful tax. Levied upon commodities and adjudged not by the common judges of property, but by wretches. He loves that word. He says wretches. Hired by those to whom excise is paid. And he was nearly in prison for that. They were going to bring in a lawsuit to have him done for libel for that, but he managed to get away with it. But anyway, again, that was the sort of thing he was criticised for. And, of course, pastern, the knee of a horse. Now, Boswell tells the first part of the story, ignorance, madam, pure ignorance. But in this rather wonderful book, which I love, it's called Johnsonian Miscellanies, Volume 2, still available on the internet if you look. Now, this book is all eyewitness accounts of people who knew or met Johnson, even some of them very briefly, just like on a stagecoach journey, or people who knew him very well indeed. And they all wanted to write down, after he was dead, the memories that they had and things he said. People became fascinated by it. And one of the best of these pieces included here is by Frances Reynolds, the younger sister of Joshua Reynolds, the painter who you saw before, who knew Johnson very well and has lots and lots of wonderful, fascinating tidbits about him in here. And she tells the same story about this dinner, but she goes a bit further. After ignorance, madam, pure ignorance, she says, and I was told that when the lady was pressing him to eat something, he rose up with his knife in his hand and loudly exclaimed, I vow to God I cannot eat a bit more, to the general terror of the entire company, which I think is a rather more interesting version of the story than Boswell's, don't you? Because it shows you not that he was just, just making light of it. He must have sat there fuming, humiliated. Because this was a man who prided himself on his own knowledge and hated being caught out and being found wrong about anything. And after all that work that he put into this book, because you see, it's not just the definitions. Once he'd actually finished it, after all these terrible years of depression and hardship, and his wife dying, and he thought he'd done it, and it was taken so long that he'd actually run out of money. He actually owed the publishers money by the end of it, because he'd been borrowing extra bits to get through. And then they said, oh, well, actually, no, you've done all that. Now, having done that, you have to write the history of the English language. So he then had to start work on that, and here it is, page after page, lots and lots of quotations and explanations, so going right back to Saxon, Old English, Middle English, showing how the language evolved right up to Elizabethan times into the language as it was in 1750. A colossal task in itself. Then, when he thought that was done, they said, oh, actually, wait a minute, you haven't done the grammar of the English tongue yet. You've got to do that as well. So he then had to do this sheer drudgery of going through every letter one by one, explaining every little minute detail, where the tongue is placed in the mouth in order to pronounce each letter or combination of letters, which words, which syllables are stressed, in which combination of syllables, all that stuff had to be there. He must have known no one was ever going to read this. And to this day, nobody ever has. But it's all there. It's like a textbook. It's like if a Martian came down to Earth. Here it is, everything you need to know about the English language in the mid-18th century and very much as it is today still. It's all there. And then to be criticised for pastern, and all these little, these odd things, these little occasional lapses from true, scientific objectivity. But actually there is something else in the book, which I think is really what makes it remarkable. And it's actually the preface, because he had to write a preface as well. And here it is, page after page after page, all about his methodology, his philosophy behind the work he'd done. And it ends with this paragraph here, which is something rather extraordinary to read in a textbook, in a book of reference. He says, in this work, when it shall be found that much is omitted, let it not be forgotten that much likewise is performed. The English dictionary was written with little assistance of the learned and without any patronage of the great, not in the soft obscurities of retirement or under the shelter of academic bowers, but amidst inconvenience and distraction, in sickness and in sorrow. It may repress the triumph of malignant criticism to observe that if our language is not here fully displayed, I have only failed in an attempt which no human powers have hitherto completed. If the lexicons of ancient tongues, now immutably fixed, be yet, after the toil of successive ages, inadequate and delusive, if the aggregated knowledge and cooperating diligence of the Italian academicians could not secure them from the censure of Beni, if the embodied critics of France, when 50 years had been spent on their work, were obliged to bring out their second edition in another form, I may surely be contented without the praise of perfection, which if I could obtain in this gloom of solitude, what would it avail me? I have protracted my work till most of those whom I wish to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss it with frigid tranquility, having little to fear or hope from censure or from praise. It's hard to read it without becoming emotional. It's tragic that he did all that work and was left so unsatisfied. And he's lapsed into a great depression after it was done and back to his poverty again. Was arrested for debt not long after the book was published, and a friend of his actually records going to his rooms and seeing him sitting there without even money for pen and paper to write. This man who'd created this monument to our language. And it's not to me, it's not actually the funny, odd definitions that stand out. It's the everyday words that we still use today. A simple word, for instance, like this one here, put, P-U-T, to put. Where do you start with a word like that? You see, you can't read that paragraph without thinking of what it cost him, how hard it must have been for him to force himself to do this work, to define a word like put, where he starts here with the first definition, to lay or deposit in any place, with supporting quotes. The seventh definition, to push into action. The 14th definition, to reduce to any state. The 21st definition of put, to unite, to place as an ingredient. The 39th definition, to put off. The 45th, to put over. The 57th definition, to put together. And finally, the 66th definition, to put upon trial, to expose or summon to a solemn and judicial examination. Imagine having to sit down and shave all the meanings from that one little tiny word. That's a real achievement. And then there's some beautiful poetic things in here. Many I could choose from, but the one that always stands in my mind, Phil, do you have the rant for rant? R-A-N-T, rant. A word still in common use. People pride themselves on ranting, don't they? To rave in violent and high-sounding language without proportionable dignity of thought. So you can never go on a rant again after that. It's the proportional dignity of thought that gives you Johnson. And is, I think, it's like a little poem, really. There's a little shorter version down here, rant, high-sounding language, unsupported by dignity of thought. I mean, I think that's absolutely beautiful. It is like it's like a little poem. And this is the English language in poetry. Most of the supporting quotes are from, as he says, Shakespeare, Dryden, Milton. I think of this as the longest poem in the English language. I wish I could say it right, but you know what I mean. The longest, and And it's an incredible work. And the ironic thing is actually that last paragraph, I think, was what started to make Samuel Johnson into the celebrity he was soon to become. People must have been curious when they took that book off the shelf to look up a simple word and read that paragraph to wonder, who was he, this man? And so people started to seek him out. Now, Johnson, as I say, was rescued. His life was changed by the book, because after this period of poverty that he went back into, his friends got together and said, this is appalling that this man is suffering and has no food or pens or paper. So some of his more powerful friends petitioned the government to give him a pension, which they did, £300 a year, which even then wasn't a huge amount of money, it wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to save him from this terrible penury. And being the sort of man he was, he didn't spend it on himself, he spent it on other people, looking after people who needed it more than he did. He was really, I think you could say, a true Christian, in that he believed it was a practical thing that you had to demonstrate, helping other people who needed it. That's why when he was walking through the streets of London, coming back from these meetings of the great minds, he would be talking to real people and giving pennies, putting pennies in the hands of sleeping beggar children, as he said, to at least give them a chance to beg on. And he would talk to all sorts of people. There's a story about him seeing a prostitute lying, fainting with hunger in the street, and he just went and picked this girl up and put her over his shoulder and took her home, not to ravish her, as some might have done, but to help her, to give her food and sustenance and new clothes, and to give her some moral instruction so that she might have a better chance of a happier life. He felt that was his duty to do that. And his house was full, not of the great and the good, but of these strange kind of reprobates and waifs and strays who had nowhere else to go. There was a woman called Mrs. Williams, an old blind poetess, very querulous, nasty, bad-tempered old woman. And she was a friend of Johnson's wife, and when his wife was dying, she said, "Oh, Samuel, please look after Mrs. Williams." So whenever he had a house for the rest of his life, when he only had a room, Mrs. Williams would have a room too. He always included her in all his calculations of what he was going to do. And there was another person in the house, Dr. Levitt, this old quack doctor. He was in his late 70s when he died, but Johnson had known him for 30 years, always gave him somewhere to live, rent-free. They had breakfast together for 30 years and hardly ever spoke a word to each other. But Johnson was devoted to him and really admired this man, because he was a doctor who used to not work in any of the great institutions, but he used to go out into the streets of London and minister to the poorest people, the poorest of the poor, walking miles and miles every day with his strange potions to give them a little bit of comfort. And he would go to these great dungeons where the poor had to go, because of course there was no welfare system, people were on their own. And he would have hundreds of poor, starving, filthy, dirty people dying down there and desperately in need of some kind of help. Levitt would go and minister to these people, most of whom couldn't afford even to pay him with money. He would take whatever payment they could give him, often gut-rot gin, a little glass of that, you see, a tot of that. That was his payment. So he was always drunk. I always imagine him being about Albert Steptoe, you know, and Johnson said he was the only man who ever became inebriated through motives of prudence. And people said, couldn't understand it. Why has he got this terrible old man in his house all the time? And Boswell said to Oliver Goldsmith, he said, what does he see in this man? And Goldsmith wonderfully said, he is poor and he is honest. That is recommendation enough for Johnson. Isn't that a wonderful thing to have said about you? And the other person who lived in the house was a black boy, Frank Barber, who was a slave in a plantation in Jamaica, that was owned by a friend of Johnson's, although he did not at all approve of slavery. And this boy was given to him, here's your slave. Now, Johnson was not the sort of man to allow anybody to be his slave, and he was fiercely independent. So, of course, he treated the boy as his son. He made him part of the family. And Frank lived in Johnson's house for most of his life, right to the end. He was with Johnson when he died, and when the will was read out, most of Johnson's money was left to Frank Barber. And so he had all this amazing household. And people, as I say, started to want to know about Johnson. Now, how am I doing it for time? I've got some time to read to you some rather fascinating eyewitness accounts of this strange man. There were all sorts of strange peculiarities about him, which you would never guess. from reading his work. And Boswell, when he came down, of course, wanted to meet this great man who he expected to be very, regal, with a great wig and fine clothes. And he had many, many attempts to meet Johnson, and he kept missing him all the time. People would say, oh, he should have been here last week. He was in great form, he should have been here. Say, oh, can you come here next week? No, I'm going to be in Scotland. Oh, what a pity, he's going to be here next week. And he kept missing him, and finally, on 16th of May, he writes here in his journal the next day, he said, I drank tea at Davis's. This is a bookshop where he knew that Johnson used to come in Davis's in Russell Street, and about 7, in came the great Mr. Samuel Johnson, whom I have so long wished to see. Mr. Davis introduced me to him, and as I knew his mortal antipathy to the Scotch, I cried to Davis, don't tell him where I come from. However, he said, from Scotland. Mr. Johnson, I said, yes, I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it. Sir, he replied, that I find is what a very great many of your countrymen cannot help. Think about it. It's a play on words. Boswell means I'm from Scotland. Johnson means you've come away from Scotland to be here. A lot of your countrymen cannot help. Mr. Johnson is a man of the most dreadful appearance. He is a very big man, who is troubled with sore eyes, the palsy, and the king's evil, which is scrofula, scars. He had scrofula as a child, scars all over his face. He is very slovenly in his dress and speaks in a most uncouth voice. Yet his great knowledge and strength of expression command vast respect and render him very excellent company. He has great humour and is a worthy man, but his dogmatical roughness of manners is disagreeable. He was soon to mend his opinion of that, of his dogmatical roughness of manner, and he eventually ended up writing down everything he could remember that Johnson had said, which is why we know so much about what he said now, thanks to Johnson. Boswell. But, sorry, bear with me. There's another account that he gives, which gives an indication of some of the strange physical peculiarities of Johnson, and takes you very vividly, I think, into what it would be like to be in the room with him, talking to him. Boswell says in the Life of, while talking or even musing as he sat on his chair, he commonly held his head to one side towards the right shoulder and shook it in a tremulous manner, moving his body backwards and forwards and rubbing his left knee in the same direction with the palm of his hand. In the intervals of articulating, he made various sounds with his mouth, sometimes as if ruminating, or what is called chewing the cud, sometimes getting a half whistle, sometimes making his tongue play backwards from the roof of his mouth, as if clucking like a hen, sometimes protruding it against his upper gums in front, as if pronouncing quickly under his breath. It's quite hard to get all this in one go. And sometimes he had a thoughtful look, but more frequently a smile. And generally, when he had concluded a period in the course of a dispute, by which time he was a good deal exhausted by violence and vociferation, he used to blow out his breath like a whale. That's just the beginning. And by the way, I have something which a very nice lady who's a producer here and also a prop maker called Ronnie Dorsey. I showed her a picture of Johnson, and she said, I'll make you a wig. She came in the next day with this. She took apart an old pillow. Have you got the picture of him with his? There he is, you see, there, that's it. So I'll just put it on so you can have a sense of it. It's the nearest we'll get, I think. There we are. You notice it's all brown on one side. That's because Johnson was very blind in one eye, and when he was reading at night by candlelight, he used to get too close to the flame, and he would be on fire during the night. And so he'd always go around with this terrible old wig with all flying little bits of twigs sticking out of, you know. But there's more, you see, there's more. Frances Reynolds, bless her heart, gives us lots of accounts. Actually, I've extracted them because they're peppered through the book, and I've extracted them, and I'll read these to you. This is what she says about him. She says, the strange positions in which he would place his feet are scarcely credible. Sometimes he would make the back part of his heels to touch, and sometimes the extremities of his toes, as if endeavouring to form a triangle or some geometrical figure. And as for his gestures with his hands, they were equally strange. Sometimes he would hold them up as if he had been seized with the cramp, and sometimes at his breast, like those of a jockey on full speed. So he's doing this and this at the same time. And often he would lift them up as high as he could stretch over his head for some minutes at a time. But the maneuver that most particularly used to engage the attention of company was his stretching out his arm with a full cup of tea in every direction, often to the great annoyance of the person sitting next to him. Indeed, to the imminent danger of their clothes, perhaps of a lady's court dress. Nor has anyone, I believe, described his extraordinary gestures and antics with his hands and feet, particularly when passing over the threshold of a door, or indeed before he would venture through any doorway. On entering Sir Joshua Reynolds' house with poor Mrs. Williams, a blind lady who lived with him, he would quit her hand, or else whirl her about on the steps as he whirled and twisted about to perform his gesticulations. And as soon as he had finished, he would give a sudden spring and make such an extensive stride over the threshold as if he was trying for a wager to see how far he could stride, Mrs. Williams groping about outside the door, unless the servant or of the house more commonly took her by the hand to conduct her in, leaving Dr. Johnson to perform at the parlour door much the same exercise all over again. One Sunday morning, as I was walking with him in Twickenham Meadows, he began his antics with both his hands and feet, with the latter as if he were holding the reins of a horse on full speed. Listen to me like this. And I well remember that his movements were so extraordinary that men, women and children gathered around him laughing. At last we sat down on some logs of wood by the riverside, and they nearly dispersed, when he pulled out of his pocket Grotius's De Veritate Religionis, over which he seesawed at such a violent rate as to excite the curiosity of people at some distance come over and see what was the matter with him. Now, let me just take this off, just because horrible thing to wear. But you know, it's actually almost quite distressing to read this about him. And you wonder why. What was going on in his mind that he was doing all this? The only thing I can think of is that his brain was so full of information, and it was constantly processing all this information. I think his brain was just doing too much. His synapses must have been going berserk. And I think that's probably what it was. He couldn't control his body at all when he was in public, or on his own. The only time he could was when he was sitting for a picture. And they said that then he was a model of how you should sit for a painting, absolutely still. But the rest of the time, always in motion. And this is what people, obviously they're very interested in. It's very fascinating to read about all this. But you know, as I was continuing my studies on Johnson, as I became more fascinated by him, I was actually led away from all that towards somewhere I never expected to be, which is his own writings. His writings in which all the dignity which his disabilities forbid him from having are all in his writing. And the strange thing is, you see, that nobody ever reads it anymore. Even people who consider themselves Johnsonians seldom read his writings. They like the one-liners and the funny stories, which is fair enough, as I did for years. But there's so much in here that I feel I've stumbled across a kind of motherlode of wisdom and practical wisdom that you can use in everyday life. And that, as I say, nobody's ever going to read to you, and so I'm going to do it. It's my privilege on Johnson's 300th anniversary of his birth, not today, but this year, to, rather like at the end of a pantomime when they throw sweets out to the audience, to spend this last section of the show, the last 20 minutes, just giving you some of this pure, unadulterated, solid gold Johnson. This is the real thing. This is the real sound. This is what he wanted to leave us, not all those crazy, freakish things, but his own work. The same incisiveness that he brought to defining our language, he also took to another project which was going on at the same time, the Rambler essays. These were written whilst he was doing the dictionary. He did 2 a week, and he got 2 guineas a go for them. That was one reason for doing them, just to get him by. But there was a moral dimension. He felt it was his moral duty to give you a kind of guidebook to the human mind, to how our psyches work. all the things we do that trip us up and ensnare us. Our vanity, one of his favorite words, vanity. Our ego, as Freud was later to define it. But here we are, Johnson, 150 years before, and he's right on top of it, and all in that wonderful, glorious language. Now, a lot of people say, oh, this is just only dusty academics read this stuff. So I feel I've got it to myself. And it's my privilege to pass on just a few of my favorite Johnson passages to you, and I hope you'll find them as useful as I do. I'm sourcing them from two main sources. The Rambler essays, this is my copy, which I got online again. This is an 1850 edition. This will be buried with me. I love this book so much. And also Rasselas, The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, a very short novel that he wrote in the evenings of one week to defray the costs of his funeral. And so my English teacher, when I was doing my A-levels, I asked her, what's your favourite work of literature? And she said, oh, without doubt, Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. She said, it's full of the wisdom of the ages on every page. And I regret it took me 20 years and 6 or 7 years after she died to finally get around to reading it, and I realised, yes, she was right. Now, the language, of course, is very formal. It's got that grandeur and magisteriality of Johnson. But it's like Shakespeare. Once you've got the rhythm of it, it is full of just pure gems of wisdom. And I want to start with a passage which sprang out to me when I first read it in one of the Ramblers, where he's talking about the uses of biography. And he says, and by the way, I should say there are two Johnson voices. There's his reported voice, the Lichfield voice, but I think his literature, his own writing, the voice he heard in his head was much more grand and formal. So this is how I hear it. I've often thought that there has rarely passed a life of which a judicious and faithful narrative would not be useful. For not only every man has, in the mighty mass of the world, countless numbers in the same condition with himself, to whom his mistakes and miscarriages, escapes and expedients would be of immediate and apparent use, but there is such a uniformity in the state of man that there is scarce possibility of good or ill but is common to humankind. We are all prompted by the same motives, all deceived by the same fallacies, all animated by hope, obstructed by danger, entangled by desire, and seduced by pleasure. And I love that, because he's saying we're all the same. We are so often encouraged to see the differences between each other. Race, religion, class, age, what city you live in, all that stuff is rubbish. We are all more similar than we are different. And that's what compassion is all about. That's the beginning of compassion, making that realization. It's the beginning of love in its larger sense, seeing yourself in other people and them in you. And that, I think, is one of the key Johnson passages for me that I found very moving. It's sort of summed up with something I'd always felt, and I'd never known how to say, but there it is. We are all prompted by the same motives, all deceived by the same fallacies, all animated by hope, obstructed by danger, entangled by desire, and seduced by pleasure. And there's another, in Rasselas, there's another passage that leapt out at me. He's got an amazing way of making you see something you think you know all about in a completely different way. They're talking, the story of Rasselas is about this prince who has everything he needs. He lives in this place called the Happy Valley, where everyone's rich and everyone's happy, and everyone's bored because there's no choice. So he decides to go out on a journey to seek the choice of life. And he takes with him his younger sister and his philosopher teacher, Imlac, who is basically Johnson. And every time Imlac speaks, you get pure, unadulterated, glorious Johnsonian wisdom. And they're talking about the pyramids. There they are in Cairo, and they're looking at the pyramids, trying to decide why they were built. You know, there's easier ways to bury your dead than building a pyramid, and you can dig a hole in the ground if you want to bury your treasure. Why a pyramid? And Imlac says, I consider this mighty structure as a monument of the insufficiency of human enjoyments. A king whose power is infinite and whose treasures surmount all real and imaginary wants is compelled to solace by the erection of a pyramid the satiety of dominions and the tastelessness of pleasures, and amuse the tediousness of declining life by seeing thousands labouring without end, and one stone for no purpose laid upon another. Whoever thou art, that not content with a moderate condition, imaginest happiness in royal magnificence, or dreams that command or riches can feed the appetite of novelty with perpetual gratifications, survey the pyramids and confess thy folly. I thought of that the other day when I was on the internet, and I saw a story about Jerry Springer. It said, Jerry Springer has a strange obsession which he indulges in every night when he gets home from work. Click here to find out what it is. Of course, I had to know. Had to know what it was. Turns out when he goes home every night, he obsessively trawls the internet looking for adverts for useless objects, gadgets, new things. And he orders them, knowing that he will never ever use them. But he must, after all these years, have warehouses full of the stuff. Those are his pyramids. He's feeding the appetite of novelty with perpetual gratifications. A natural human trait. And there's another one about actors. Now, we have here in the front row one of my favourite actors, Graham Crowden, who you know from the films of Lindsay Anderson and from Waiting for God. Now, you're an actor. You know all about how superstitious they are, aren't you? Also superstitious, don't they? You know, you say something, you say the wrong word, say Macbeth by mistake, and you have to go out to the dressing room, turn round 3 times, sing Yankee Doodle Dandy and do a tap dance and go, all that rubbish, you see. And there's a bit in Rasselas where the prince thinks he's found a good omen, and Imlac stops him. He says, do not disturb your mind with other hopes or fears than reason may suggest. If you are pleased with the prognostics of good, you'll be terrified likewise with tokens of evil, and your whole life will be a prey to superstition. That's good advice. All actors should know that. They should be on the wall of every dressing room. And does anyone do the lottery here? Who does the lottery? Everybody does the lottery, whether you admit it or not. Of course! I've always wanted to go in when there's a rollover week. £35 million on offer. And everybody's dreaming about what they could do and how generous they would be with all their friends, who they would give some money to, who they would deny. And you see them all lined up there. I've been in that queue sometimes too, all engaged in the act of wishing, all showing by their presence in that queue how dissatisfied they are with their own lives. I long to go in and say, rouse from this lazy dream of fortuitous riches, which, if you could have obtained, could scarcely have given you pleasure, for they could give no consciousness of having been deserved. Return to rational and manly industry, and consider the mere gift of luck as below the care of a wise man. That should be printed as a government health warning on the back of every lottery ticket. Make people be a lot happier. And there's other, of course, big subjects as well, which he has practical advice. It's like a visit to the doctor. You know, you have something that's troubling you, go to Johnson, and in there somewhere you'll find an essay on the subject, like grief, for instance, sorrow, as he calls it, grief, which he acknowledges in looking at the subject on all sides, as he always does, that it's something you can't escape from in life. If you are a functioning member of the human race and you have love in your heart, you will then proportionately at some point have to feel grief, unless you decide to close yourself off from all emotion, which is an intolerable idea. So it's something you can't escape from. How do you treat it? And remember, this is a man who himself suffered terribly from grief. He ends, the last line of the essay is, sorrow is a kind of rust of the soul, which each new idea contributes in its passage to scour away. It is the putrefaction of stagnant life and is remedied by exercise and motion. Isn't that useful advice? Johnson was a great believer in motion. When somebody asked him what his idea of perfect happiness would be, he said to ride very fast, indeed, in a post-chaise with a pretty girl to nowhere in particular. It's the very fast bit that really gives you Johnson. And another story, there was a friend of his, Bennet Langton, who as a young man had known Johnson, and years after Johnson had died, he was taking a friend on a walk behind his house, up a hill, steep hill behind the house. And he stopped and he said, this is where poor Dr. Johnson rolled down the hill. He said, what do you mean roll down? He said, well, we were walking with him, and he said, I haven't done a roll for a long time. And when we realized what he was going to do, we tried to dissuade him, but no, he wouldn't hear of it. Emptied his pockets of all his pens and pencils and bits of string, and he lay down parallel with the edge of the hill and actually rolled and rolled all the way down to the bottom, which I think was his way of actually just getting out of his own mind for a while, even just for a few seconds. Somebody asked him why people go fox hunting, why do people go riding on horseback? And he said, because man is less aware of his own vacuity when he is in motion. Which explains a lot about it. I think Johnson would have thought that we here, living now in the 21st century, would have a greater chance of happiness of any human beings who ever lived, because we have so many distractions from our inner life, from ourselves. You know, not only do we have motion, we can get on a bus even, which he would have loved, I think, to go and get on a bus. You know, cars, or fly off to anywhere in the world very cheaply, and we have the internet, television, this festival, all these wonderful distractions from thinking about ourselves, from thinking about, as I say, our inner lives. Actually, that's a good point. This is very good advice here. It'll give you an idea of what it's like to be up here doing a show. He says, though it should happen that an author may be capable of excelling, yet his merit may pass without notice, huddled in the variety of things, and thrown into the general miscellany of life. He who endeavours after fame by writing solicits the regard of a multitude fluctuating in pleasures, or immersed in business without time for intellectual amusements. He appeals to judges prepossessed by passions or corrupted by prejudices which preclude their approbation of any new performance. Some are too indolent to read anything until its reputation is established, others too envious to promote that fame which gives them pain by its increase. What is new is opposed, because most are unwilling to be taught. What is known is rejected, because it is not sufficiently considered that men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. The learned are afraid to declare their opinion early, lest they put their reputation in hazard. The ignorant always imagine themselves giving some proof of delicacy when they refuse to be pleased. And he who finds his way to reputation against all these obstacles must acknowledge that he is indebted to other causes besides his industry, his learning, or his wit. And some good advice. I don't know if there's any performers out there who suffered at the hands of the critics this year. Well, learn this. Criticism is a study by which men grow formidable and important at a very small expense. The power of invention has been conferred by nature upon few, and the labor of learning those sciences which may by mere labor be obtained is too great to be willingly endured. But every man can exert such judgment as he has upon the works of others. And he whom nature has made weak and idleness keeps ignorant may yet support his vanity by the name of a critic. Remember, he wrote that, not me. I didn't say that. If you're quoting it on me. And another quote which I love, which again from Rasselas, and it always makes me think of this room, because it's about the prince. The prince thinks he's found happy people at last. That's what his search is all about. And he goes to a great big party in a glittering ballroom, and he goes to Imlac and the next day and tells them about it. And he can't understand, he says, why, when everybody else at this party seemed so happy, he himself felt so sad. Imlac says, every man may, by examining his own mind, guess at what passes in the minds of others. When you find your gaiety to be counterfeit, it may justly lead you to suspect that of your companions not to be sincere. Envy is commonly reciprocal. We are long before we are convinced that happiness is never to be found, and everyone believes it possessed by others to keep alive the hope of obtaining it for himself. In the assembly where you passed the last evening, there appeared such sprightliness of air and volatility of fancy as seemed suited to beings of a higher order, formed to inhabit serener regions, inaccessible to care and sorrow. Yet believe me, Prince, there was not one who did not dread the moment when solitude should deliver him to the tyranny of reflection. That's the key Johnson phrase for me, the tyranny of reflection. What our minds do when suddenly they've all gone and you're on your own. What do you think about? How do you keep your mind away from attacking itself? All those bad thoughts that come up. When I wake up at 3 in the morning and I feel so alone, and I always think about two things: death, I'm going to die, oh no, I'm going to die, all that, you know. And all the bad feelings about myself come out. I'm no good, oh, it's terrible. And yet I come up here every year to Edinburgh and I go through the same thing, what I call my Edinburgh psychosis. Every year, even years when I've done really well, you know, I always think everybody else is doing better. They all seem to have longer queues outside their venues, better reviews with more stars, undeservedly. And I get caught up in all these bad feelings, and somebody else comes to you and says, oh, they tell you all their good news, and you're going, oh, that's nice. And really, you're thinking, oh, why isn't my agent working harder? I should be doing that kind of thing. It's terrible. It destroys you, and I'm going to be very honest with you now. I'm going to tell you. Have I got time? Yes, I have a couple of minutes. Envy is one of my worst things, and Johnson, I've had the best festival ever this year. Do you know why? Because of Johnson. He's helped me to get over it. For a start, I haven't read any reviews. Not my own, not even other people's bad reviews, which is normally one of the most piquant pleasures of the Fringe. Let's see who's got 1 star, you know. But I haven't muddied my mind with all that, I haven't disturbed my mind with all that. I've just come out here and I've done my show for whoever's been here. This is quite a big audience for me, actually. I usually have a lot less. And instead of what I always do, which is lamenting the people who haven't come, I rejoice in those of you that have honoured me by giving up your time and your money to come and hear me wittering on about an 18th century lexicographer. Thank you very much. It's wonderful that you're here and that we're having this conversation. And I'll just very quickly tell you about something, a terrible thing that happened to me, about an awful envy that came over me a couple of years ago. See, if I'm known at all in Edinburgh, really, it's because of a show I did originally in 1996 about Kenneth Williams. Anybody see that show? Anybody know? Oh, no, please. No praise. And no, it was the show that made me. I mean, I was 34, I had never done any work on my own before, and I did this show out of desperation to launch myself on the world, and it worked. I went from total obscurity to the possibility of a career in 3 weeks. And it was wonderful, and everybody kept saying it was uncanny, my impersonation. Uncanny, they kept saying. I thought, that's it, wonderful, you see, and that really started me off on my road. And then just 2 or 3 years ago, I heard rumours that there was going to be a television play about Kenneth Williams. And I thought, that's interesting. So I got the agent, I said, get in touch with them. And he did, and they said, the producer said, well, could we see a copy of the video of his show? And he sent the video, nothing more was heard. Then about 2 years later, I get a call from, of all people, Richard and Judy, saying that this play about Kenneth Williams is on television tonight, and we'd like you to come on and talk about Kenneth Williams. They wanted me to go onto their show to talk about somebody else's impersonation of Kenneth Williams, Michael Sheen. I thought, Michael Sheen? Who is this Michael Sheen? So I went along, and I was sitting on the sofa there with lovely Barry Cryer, who really, lovely man, he got me through the whole thing. And there I was, and the lights went down and the screen came up, and there was this clip from Fantabulosa. And I watched it in horror, because there was some lines that I had written from my show. That maybe subconsciously the author of this piece had lifted. The bit where he's talking to the navvies outside his window. He's like, oh, lovely big hole you got there, isn't it? Yes, lovely old, yes, is he? I was watching it, and then, you know, then the lights came up in the studio, and Richard turned to me and he said, uncanny, wasn't it? I thought that was my word. That's what they used to say about me. Uncanny, he said. What do you think? So I had to sort of do the biggest acting job I've ever done in my life. I had to go, oh, wonderful, really, really good, lovely, yes, I wish it were all success in the world. I was fuming I was, and then I started to look into this Michael Sheen, and I started to find out what he'd been doing, and I thought, oh, he's really successful, he's got to fail at some point, hasn't he? I was waiting for him to fail, and he wouldn't. Everything he touches turns to gold. And Nixon, you know, these great, huge, they love him. He's got the OBE and everything. And I decided he had to be killed. So then, in February this year, I was in York, coming back on the train early in the morning from doing a play up there. And I was on the platform about 9:30 in the morning. And who should I see waiting for the train? Michael Sheen, standing a few yards away, quite unrecognised, just minding his own business, with a very pretty young girl who I took to be his press agent. And I thought, right, well, what do I do? Shall I say, no, he might be nasty to me, and he might be, you know. So I moved down the platform a bit, and the train pulled in, and I opened the door to get on, and I looked there, and there he was. He'd decided to come on the same carriage, and we looked, there he was. I was face to face with my nemesis. And I looked him in the eye, and I said, well, it's not often you find two Kenneth Williams impersonators on one train, is it? And he said, no, it isn't. And we got on. He said, well, come and sit with us. And we got on those little tables, you know, and we sat face to face. Of course, it was a Sunday, so there was engineering works. It was a long, delayed journey. 3.5 hours we sat there, talking, him and his girlfriend. And by the time we got to London, I loved him. He was one of the nicest people you could wish to meet. And I realized he was very sympathetic. He understood how it must have been for me. And I realized that he had worked hard himself, used his own talents, and he'd put himself on the line, and he had got his success through sheer hard work and diligence and talent. And that he had responsibilities on his shoulders that I don't have. He's got the hope, he has to carry the hopes and fears and expectations of other people on his shoulders, and lots of money riding on all these films and things that he does. He has lots of pressures. And in the end of the day, he's going to die too. It's not just me or just you. We're all going to go the same way. And how, as Johnson said, can you envy someone who's got the same punishment ahead of them? But it changed completely, how I felt about him. And now, really, I only wish good things for him and for them, because they're lovely people. As long as he doesn't do a show about Samuel Johnson. In which case, hostilities will be immediately resumed. But actually, the funny payoff to it was that a couple of days later, I was in the pub talking to my brother late at night, and my phone suddenly started going berserk. And they're all saying, you've just been mentioned on Jonathan Ross, Friday Night with Jonathan Ross. Michael Sheen's on, and he told the story about how he met you on the train. So suddenly I had this amazing kind of moment of celebrity, and all my friends were like, wow, Jonathan Ross. I was like, well, thank you, I'm glad. I did get on the same carriage with him, and I'm glad I did change my opinion and give up all that stupid envy. And I'm just going to leave you now with a final passage from Johnson, which is all about that. It's all about how envy eats you up, and it's only yourself that it hurts. And he uses, as his jumping off point for this, talking about the imminence of death. He loves talking about death. And he felt it was a good thing to remember that any of us could go at any minute, and that when you have a near-death experience, it can change everything. And this is what he says. The extensive influence of greatness, the glitter of wealth, the praises of admirers, and the attendance of supplicants have all seemed vain and empty things when the last hour seemed to be approaching. And the same appearance they would always have if the same thought was always predominant. Then we would find the absurdity of stretching out our arms incessantly to grasp that which we cannot keep, and of wearing out our lives in endeavors to add new turrets to the fabric of ambition when the foundation itself is shaking and the ground on which it stands is mouldering away. All envy is proportionate to desire. We are uneasy at the attainments of another according as we think our own happiness would be advanced by the addition of that which he withholds from us. Therefore, whatever depresses immoderate wishes will at the same time set the heart free from the corrosion of envy and exempt us from that vice which is above most others, tormenting to ourselves, hateful to the world, and productive of mean artifices and sordid projects. He who considers how soon he must close his life will find nothing of so much importance as to close it well. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Phil Spencer Hunter on lights and slides. Samuel Johnson. Thank you. Thank you.